Can we just
And
go back to Maitland before we go to Tocqueville? Because I know Tocqueville is another of your big, very influential characters. But just so that, because I think a lot of people probably don't know about Maitland
yeah,
outside of history. I mean, and his big thing was this notion of the trust, wasn't it? And the
yeah.
setting up of the trust. So could you tell us a little bit about that? I suppose the question for me when I was reading that was, which came first, or which was the most? Was the trust that caused us to be like, or was it because we were like this that we set up trust? And how come we were allowed trusts? How come Henry VIII, when he tried to ban it, was unsuccessful? Why were our monarchs so weak that they couldn't stop the trusts, whereas presumably in France and everywhere else they didn't have this thing?
Well, one has to say that although this, for me, is the most important of Maitland's ideas, the trust, he's not best known for it. It's only a minor part of his work, and he's best known for much of his other legal work on boroughs and on equity and so on. So it's a part of his work, but it's important to me. He only came on this idea again himself in his last 5 or 6 years when he was ill, and he came on it really again as a kind of culture shock. He was very, very widely read. He read German and French, and he knew Roman law. And he was particularly friends and colleagues with a number of the greatest legal thinkers of that time tended to be Germans, like Gierke. And he was in correspondence with Gierke. And these Germans looked at English law and they said, this trust idea, what is it? We cannot understand it. It reminds me of when Bourdieu, the French sociologist, came to Cambridge and said to Peter Burke, what are these colleges? We don't have colleges in France. What is a college? Gierke said, what is this trust idea? And Maitland said, all right, I'll explain it to you. So perhaps I ought to just explain what the idea of a trust is, since it's so central. It's one of the 2 planks of modernity, I think, which makes modern civilization really possible. The idea is that when it started, was that you had a landholder who all property was held of the king. So he was holding his large estate, say the Duke of whatever it is, the Earl of Essex, held his property of the king. And when he dies, because it's held of the king, it goes back to the king. He's a tenant in chief of the king. The king then has the right, if he hasn't got heirs who are of full age, who he can transfer it to, and even then he has some rights, but if he only has young children, the king then owns the property and he can milk it for as much as he likes in 2 principal ways. If there are daughters, he can arrange their marriages and get the payments for those marriages. And while the estates are in his hand, he can take all the rents and profits from them. So it's an inheritance tax, and it can be a huge inheritance tax. It can be 10 or 20 years of all the profits from the estate going to the king. Now, for obvious reasons, as most people don't like inheritance taxes, the chief tenants didn't like these inheritance taxes. And they turned to their lawyers in the 14th century and said, is there any way around this? And the lawyers were now in a legal tradition which was already deviating a lot from Roman law, even by the 14th century, though there were a lot of overlaps. And they looked around and they found some ideas in Anglo-Saxon law, and they found a few ideas in Roman law. And they mixed these together. And they said, we suggest that we set up a fictional body. English law was full of fictions. Everyone knows it isn't true, but as far as the law is concerned, we can pretend that it is true. And this will mix two things which you cannot mix together in Roman law. That is the law of the person and the law of things. So we will create a fictional body which is like a human being. You make it, it lives, it exists, and then at some point it may die. It has all the properties of a human being, but it is just things. You can't do that in Roman law, but we will try and do that for you. And the way we'll do it is that when you are alive, there's the king there, there's you there, you will gather together a number of your friends, say 12 of them, give them a nice dinner and lots of good drink, and then say to them, look, you're my friends. I trust you. I absolutely trust you. I'm going to do something very foolish, but I trust you. I'm going to give you all my estates. Here is my deed box with all my deeds in. It's yours. I am now no longer the owner of this property, though I will go on collecting the rents and so on for a while, if that's all right with you. You take it away, and you are now the tenants. And I do this in the hope and trust that you will, when I die, give all this deed box back to my son. You don't have to. You can go off to the south of France and have a good time. But you are my friends, and friendship is strong, and I believe you will do this. And so will you do that for me? And they say, yes. Out of our love for you and for your family, we will do that, and we will protect your children. So they go off. 10, 20 years later, he goes off to the Crusades, because some theories suggest this was a device which was particularly useful for people, going off on crusades and things. And he's killed, or he dies. And then the king comes back, goes to his castle, or the king's servants go to the castle and said, where's the deed box? The guy's died, his children are young. We want the king's property. And the servants say, sorry, no deed box here. It's in Hedingham Castle with X, who owns it. It was transferred to them, 10 years ago. And the king goes and knocks on Hedingham Castle, and the person says, sorry, it's ours. And then next year, the king hears that they've taken the deed box, or 5 years later, when the child becomes of age, they take it back and give it to the son. Now that device was invented in the 14th century, and it went against Roman law and was very odd. And for a while, it was extremely useful in avoiding death duties. Then sometime in the later 15th century, a time of the beginning of the Tudors and so on, people began to see that this was had many potentials outside just avoiding inheritance acts, particularly because it was protected. The extraordinary thing was that the English legal system was divided into different parts, and part of it, the common law and equity were separate, and the head of equity was the Lord Chancellor. He was a senior legal figure in England. And because this was to do with not common law, but with trust and things that are to do with right and equity and fairness, he took on the role of guarding the trust idea. So if there were disputes about trusts, it didn't go to the common law courts, it would go to Chancery and the equity courts. And the Lord Chancellor would sit there and say, it's only fair that it goes to the son. So the most powerful legal figure in the country was set against the king and protected by the whole legal structure. So in the later, or sometime in the 15th century, people began to think, well, we now have a thing that you can create. And the marvel of it is, which completely confused German scholars like Gierke, you had these things in Roman law, but they were called corporations. A corpus is a body, and a corporation is something you breathe your breath into, and you make it live. But in Roman law, the only person who can give birth to a corporation is the crown, the king. And the person who creates it can then destroy it. So in Roman law, in say the 12th century, you had masses of corporations, all the churches, all the universities, or every kind of the cities and the boroughs. They all had charters from the king, which said, you, the city of Lyon, can do this, you can do that. You, the monastery of so-and-so, can do this, can do that. Signed, Henry the whatever. But what happened all over Europe was that these corporations, as the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries progressed and the royal power grew, the king thought, well, why am I giving away all this power to these subordinate people? I need to get it back and get the profits from it all. So he just said to Lyon or the monastery of so-and-so, I want your corporate charter back, and they could do nothing about it. Now, the wonder of the trust was that it was set up by individuals without any recourse to the crown. Anyone could set up a trust, ordinary people, which would then be protected by the Lord Chancellor. Now, if you could set it up for getting around inheritance, why not set it up for other things? And the history of the modern world is basically about how the trust idea was then applied to every sphere of British life. That's an important story, which I can tell you now if you want me to.
Yeah,